Welcome to the Astronomers for Planet Earth webinar series, hosted by Dr. Travis Rector, Professor of Astrophysics at University of Alaska, Anchorage. Today's guest is Dr. Bernadette Rodgers. Bernadette is a part-time science professor and full-time climate activist. Bernadette worked for Gemini Observatory in La Serena, Chile for nearly 13 years. 7 of those as the head of science operations for Gemini South. Since moving to Portland, Oregon in 2015, she teaches astronomy and other science courses as adjunct faculty at Portland State University, Portland Community College, and Willamette University's Pacific Northwest College of Art. As a climate activist, Bernadette currently serves on the boards of 350 PDX, the Portland chapter of 350.org, and SustainUS, a national youth-led organization focused on global climate issues. She's also involved with Climate Reality and Extinction Rebellion, and speaks about the climate crisis as often as she can.
Hi, everyone. My name is Travis Rector, and I'm a professor of physics and astronomy at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. And I'm also one of the organizers for a group called Astronomers for Planet Earth. And this is our webinar series dedicated to helping astronomers to become better climate advocates and educators. And today we're very lucky to have Bernadette Rodgers as our speaker. Bernadette and I first got to know each other when she worked at Gemini South. She was the head of science operations there. And she's taken her passion for climate issues to move north up to Portland and is now focusing much of her time on climate activism and climate justice. And so we're very lucky to have Bernadette with us here today to tell us about the work that she's been doing. Bernadette, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Travis, and thanks for that introduction. And thank you to the Astronomers for Planet Earth for hosting these webinars. And thanks to all of you for watching. So today I'm talking about climate activism. And let me say just right up front, this is not an objective science talk. In fact, it is a science talk with an objective. And I fully confess to having a strong bias in favor of life as we know it on planet Earth. And I'm pretty sure you do too. So I give climate talks to groups of all kinds and all sizes. So this is a shameless plug. Please go ahead and contact me if you're interested. I'm also interested in getting feedback on this talk in particular, and I'll remind you about that at the end. So thanks in advance. Last month, the latest IPCC report came out with ever more dire warnings, and that made headlines for a few days. Do you feel inundated by the headlines? We have disaster fatigue, I think, and maybe as scientists, a little bit of an aversion to what sometimes feels like alarmist rhetoric in the news. So what is the problem exactly? Well, these graphs are from the IPCC emissions gap report from 2019, showing projected gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions out to 2030. And to 2050 in this smaller graph below. The flat and upward lines here, these first 4, are government commitments as of 2019. And this steep downward green line is the emission cuts needed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Since we are already seeing serious impacts with 1 degree of warming right now, clearly holding to 1.5 Celsius is the goal. And the latest report tells us that probably about 1.5 degrees is already baked into our climate system, but we can hold it there with action. So the difference between the bottom line here and these top lines is what's called the carbon emissions gap. And you can see it's large, it's about 30 gigatons, which is roughly half of the projections of where we'll be in 2030 without serious action. And by the way, these, I should say, are, this graph is before the 2021 nationally determined contributions coming in this year ahead of the November COP. But so far, the new commitments are not doing much to close the gap. In fact, I just read this morning, they might get us somewhere around this 2-degree range if the rhetoric turns into reality, which is another problem. So we do know that 1.5 degree holding us there is possible, but if we have the political will. So that's the science behind these goals. And these are our marching orders: cut carbon emissions in half by 2030, 9 years away, and then reach net zero emissions by 2050. A challenging task, obviously, but I think it's good that we have a target. We know what we need to do. And in fact, when I give this talk to young people, they say, great, let's do it already. Let's get on it. And if you think that sounds naive, I'll tell you that young people would say that older generations are the ones being naive if we think we can afford not to do this, or that there will be some magical solution that gets us to this second goal without passing through the first one. So another word about that: corporations and governments love that net zero by 2050 mantra. It allows them to sound good, but continue to kick this problem down the road, which unfortunately is something we've been all too good at. On this graph, which shows different paths that get us to where we need to be by 2050, just imagine the gentle slope we might be on now if we had peaked our emissions back in the early 90s after those first COP meetings. But we didn't. And the longer we delay, the steeper the cliff is. And this is why we have to keep the focus on 2030, not on 2050. So that's the danger of that net zero at 2050 mantra. Because the point is that it's the cumulative emissions in the atmosphere, how many of those greenhouse gas molecules are up there, that matters for global warming, right? Estimates say that we have room maybe for, at best, about 500 billion tons more. That's CO2 carbon equivalents. And at 40 billion tons a year, it doesn't take fancy math to see why we have to turn things around this decade as soon as possible. So if all it took was a well-defined problem and some solutions, and the world listened to scientists, we would have solved this problem decades ago. That's where activism comes in. What do you think of activism? I feel like activism sometimes gets a bad rap in the science community. Here's what I call it. It's my working definition: is using your personal agency to affect change outside of your direct control. All good, right? And it's a spectrum of activity. And in fact, activists call this spectrum the ladder of engagement. So for example, maybe you vote, I hope you vote with the climate crisis in mind. Additional steps up the ladder would be contacting, writing, or calling your representatives, maybe visiting a representative or a senator, or giving testimony at your local city council. And then maybe you might consider disrupting the halls of power or holding a sit-in in someone's office. Talking about it, Katherine Hayhoe tells us one of the most important things we can do is talk about climate change. I absolutely agree, and we can do more than that. Let's amplify that. Maybe consider giving public talks, writing an op-ed in your local paper. You want higher energy? Try speaking at a rally. That's pretty exciting. You can give money, sign petitions, attend marches. You get the idea. There's a lot of steps on this ladder, and we're looking to move up. The best way to do that is to join a group doing some of these things. And here's a tip, and I'll talk more about that later, but here's an insider tip. The top of the ladder is the most fun, in my opinion. So why do we need more activists? And we need more activists up high on that ladder of engagement. It's political scientists tell us that it takes about 3.5% of the population actively involved to win a movement, a social movement. And the Yale Climate Change Communication Program has divided us into what they call the 6 Americas, based on our level of concern about the climate crisis. So I propose we can ignore these folks. We already have more than half the country in these top 2 bubbles of concerned and alarmed. However, the issue is that when we look in more detail, and this is a recent report from the same group, at this alarmed category, actively what they call actively alarmed is actually only about a third of the group, whereas about half are willing or likely to be active. And actually, when you read the fine print, it turns out even in this active group, only 17% of the so-called active are actually participating now in campaigns or activities to persuade government. The rest say they definitely would, and that apparently counts as active. I'm not sure what they're waiting for, but apparently about 83% of this group here is likely folks that are on those bottom rungs of the ladder of engagement. And when you do the math, that puts us at less than 2% currently actively involved. So we kind of need to double that number, and moving the willing folks and then the so-called active into actually being involved now actively is more than enough to sway public opinion and push our governments to act. And that, hence, is the purpose of this talk. So you don't have to take my word for it. Here's two prominent climate scientists. Dr. James Hansen is the famous NASA climate scientist that told Congress way back in 1988 what was happening. He long since retired from NASA and has become a full-time famous activist. And he says, activism isn't easy, but it's important and necessary. We need activists. He says we can still make our democracies work, but it's hard work and it requires a lot of people. Dr. Christiana Figueres, who's the architect of the UN Paris Agreement, wrote this just recently in response to the last IPCC report. And she says, we have a responsibility now to find the inner strength to pull through. Most of us have not been answering the call from science in this way. We have to go far beyond what we think we can achieve at speed. Scientist Rebellion, which is a part of the Extinction Rebellion, puts it like this: what's the point in documenting ever greater detail the catastrophe we face if we're not willing to do anything about it? And they show rising emissions despite all these activities. And they say, and I agree, academics are perfectly placed to wage a rebellion. We exist in rich hubs of knowledge and expertise. We're well connected to decision makers and to each other across the world. We have large platforms from which to inform, educate, and rally others all over the world. And we have implicit authority and legitimacy, which is the basis of political power. We can make a difference. And these folks are a direct action group that started in Europe, and they've been having fun pasting science papers on bank doors and things like that. So, astronomers specifically, why do astronomers in particular make great activists? Well, I know quite a few. And I would say we also have intellectual agency. Folks look to us to comprehend and understand a complex planetary size problem like climate. And if we don't seem too concerned, why should they be, right? So let's show concern. Let's use language that conveys the scope of the problem. And these folks have created a scientific oath, and they say scientists and researchers who devote their entire lives to advancing human knowledge and communicating it to others have an ethical and moral obligation to educate others on the actions necessary to curtail and mitigate the worst outcomes. So that's a mouthful, but basically let's share our concern and show the urgency around this problem. In addition, and more specifically, astronomy is a gateway science. We all know this, right? We've all been at social events where strangers want to talk to us about black holes or the latest exoplanet they read about. We're natural science ambassadors by virtue of this super cool, awesome field that we have the privilege to work in. And we can take advantage of that to talk about climate. And we don't have to be climate scientists. We get planets. We can explain, for example, why the billionaire's idea that colonizing another planet is the solution to this problem is complete nonsense. We understand solar energy, the peer review process. We're researchers, educators, many of us are public speakers. So let's use our platform. And here's the story of one astronomer activist, and that's me. So in 2009, I was working at Gemini South Observatory, enjoying my job and my life. I would say I was squarely in that concerned bubble at the time, following the news and making small changes in my life, but I didn't really let the climate crisis affect me too much. And then one day I heard in a colloquium that John Lacey, principal investigator for a camera on this Sophia Observatory at the time, was stepping back from the project out of concern for the carbon emissions. Hearing John's decision made a big impression on me, and it basically triggered the trajectory I'm still on today. I was inspired that year to contact some colleagues, including John Lacey, and we organized the very first sustainability meeting at the AAS in 2010, which turned out to be a huge success and launched the AAS Sustainability Committee, which Travis actually now chairs. And I still remember two things the speaker that day, Joe Rahm, said at that meeting. He told us, enjoy astronomy while you can, because in 20 years, we're all going to be working on climate. And then he also said, the only good thing about the worsening impacts of climate change are that eventually we won't be able to ignore it anymore. And 10 years later, I feel like we're at that point. So in continuing my story later that same year, I did my first action with my daughter and a friend in Serena Chile. It wasn't much, but you got to start somewhere. And I ended up leaving Gemini a few years later and became a full-time climate activist and part-time astronomy professor. And that is what I still am today. And honestly, it didn't take too long before I was sitting on the railroad tracks protesting oil trains in Washington State. And yes, in fact, getting arrested that day when I did that. That's my path. It's not for everyone. In particular, not everyone is willing or able to take the 70% pay cut that I took. But we each have to find what works for us. And I'll tell you, I do miss doing astronomy sometimes, but you know what I don't miss? The cognitive dissonance. And when we go about our daily lives as if there isn't an emergency happening, our hearts and minds know it, even if we don't acknowledge it. So once I face the reality of this crisis, well, you can't unlearn that, and it becomes really hard to ignore. So it would be nice if it wasn't necessary to do all this work, but since it is, it's very satisfying to know that I'm doing something. So that's the selfish reason to become an activist. And I do believe action really is the antidote to despair. I've learned so much. I've expanded my worldview tremendously. I've met amazing people and had some fun too. And finally, best of all, when we fight, we win. These are just a few examples. I've been personally involved in campaigns here in the Pacific Northwest that have shut down 4 different fossil fuel export terminals in the last 7 years. That's very empowering, and I can tell you it feels good when we win. So we know that young people are speaking out so forcefully because it is their future on the line. Like so many, they are activists by necessity, not by choice, which brings me to the idea of climate justice. Around the world and across the US, Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities that have contributed the least to this problem and have the fewest resources to defend themselves are suffering first and worst from climate change. We know that existing layers of injustice, existing layers of injustice, racial, gender, generational, economic, nature itself, are amplified and multiplied by the climate crisis. So poor communities in Cancer Alley in Louisiana, dealing with horrific toxic discharges after a hurricane, Indigenous villages in Alaska and the Pacific Island nations losing their homes to sea level rise. Food scarcity, drought, and conflict across the global South, leading to dangerous forced migrations for people with very few resources and headed to often unwelcoming countries. These are all examples of climate injustice. And too often the extra burden of environmental stress falls to women and girls across the world in all kinds of ways. And this is our reality now. The world we're leaving to future generations in the worst case scenarios is difficult, frankly, to even contemplate. So yes, this is a moral issue. Climate justice is social justice. And climate justice means recognizing those disproportionate impacts on frontline communities and addressing the root causes of climate disruption. But these folks in these communities are not victims. They're actually the experts by necessity. They have answers, they are fighters. What they lack is power and resources. So they deserve and demand respect, and it's up to all of us embedded in the hubris of white supremacy to recognize this, to listen to them, and to amplify and prioritize their work. That's the gist of climate justice. As a white person myself, my lived experience does not include environmental injustice to any large degree. So let me raise up the incredible voice of someone at the intersection of multiple of these layers. Shia Bastida is a Mexican-American youth activist from Brooklyn, New York, who spoke truth to power earlier this year at Biden's Earth Day Summit. And what she said to those leaders is, the climate crisis is the result of those perpetuating and upholding the harmful systems of colonialism, oppression, capitalism, and market-oriented greenwash solutions. She says the 40 leaders who are in this summit are in the majority from the global north, which has historically perpetuated these systems. The communities who are most affected, those who have endured displacement because of drought, flooding, wildfires, crop failure, and human rights abuse, are not fully represented here today. Solutions must be aligned with the fact that climate justice is social justice. So folks, if you are like me, if you have come up through the Western system of education and enjoy lives of comfort and privilege, we have agency, we have power, and climate justice is our work to do. Hopefully now you're asking, wondering, how can I get more involved? Or if you're already doing stuff, how might I ramp up on that ladder of engagement? Well, of course, there are limitless paths, but here's my recipe, and it's pretty simple. First of all, educate yourself like any field. There's a lot to learn, and there are literally thousands of books and TED Talks and podcasts, and it can be overwhelming. I encourage you to read past the science literature, reach outside of your comfort zone, and seek the voices and perspectives you're least familiar with, and especially Indigenous voices. We know that Indigenous cultures are rooted in an ethos of interconnectedness and symbiosis with the natural world that has been ignored and suppressed for far too long, and to all of our detriment. Indigenous folks are amazing environmental activists. And in the US right now, there's actually an Indigenous renaissance happening that's really a gift to us all. So in the interest of highlighting other voices, I just want to share this one book. I actually just started reading this week. I'm pretty blown away by it already. And these are just a few quotes from the early pages. From my own experience, I can tell you that the work of addressing the climate crisis, unlike most STEM fields, is very much a woman-led field. And this book is actually a who's who of female climate activist rock stars, many of them women of color. I highly recommend it. And here's Shia again, who has the very first chapter in the book, and she tells us a vibrant, fair, and regenerative future is possible not when thousands of people do climate justice activism perfectly, but when millions of people do the best they can. So step 2, join a group or 2 or 3, find your people. The list is nearly endless. There are groups for just about any identity you want to find, and plenty of wide open groups as well. If you haven't joined Astronomers for Planet Earth, start there. If you're under 35, you can join a youth group. There's groups for just about any identity you can imagine. And even if you don't identify with that particular group, you can support all of these groups. This is only a partial list, and also doesn't even include all the so-called big greens: Greenpeace, Sierra Club, Rainforest Action Network, Ocean Conservancy. Those big orgs have broader missions and very deep pockets, also doing great climate work. Besides Astronomers for Planet Earth, my activist homes include 350.org, which was one of the first climate-specific groups, and the one that started fossil fuel divestment. Extinction Rebellion, which is a direct action group that exploded on the scene a couple of years ago, first in Europe and now in the US. The Climate Reality Project, which is a training and outreach program founded by Al Gore. And if you take their training, you get this little green ring to show that you're part of the club. Global Optimism is Christiana Figueres' organization, which has great podcasts and resources. They call themselves Stubborn Optimists, and I love their writing. And Women's Earth Alliance, which is a funding organization that helps small-scale women's programs across the developing world. So this is just a sampling of ones that I know about personally, but the list is long and the sky's the limit. And number 3, I would say, find your passion, pursue your interests. You may find yourself spending a lot of time doing this, so good to find something you like and that you're interested in. And this is tied to step 2 because a lot of organizations, of course, focus on particular tactics. There are many ways to attack this problem, and they are all needed and helpful. So you may have heard of Project Drawdown. If not, the book is simply called Drawdown. And these are pragmatic folks that are working the numbers like crazy to identify and implement solutions that give us the most bang for the buck. Really interesting website with, I think, over 100 solutions that they are sort of working the numbers on. 350.org, and I already mentioned, and Stop the Money Pipeline are 2 groups, among others, that are focused on pooling financial support from the fossil fuel industry through divestment initiatives with significant victories. I would say we just heard recently that Harvard is pledged to divest their considerable endowment from fossil fuels. The motto of this group is, if it's wrong to destroy the world, it's wrong to make money off of that destruction. There's all kinds of political organizations spanning the political spectrum, many social justice orgs that do climate work. The intersection I mentioned in climate justice about the intersection of social justice and climate justice means that more and more climate groups are paying attention to social justice, and social justice groups are paying attention to climate. I mentioned also indigenous groups. If you want to dive right into the deep end of activism, I recommend looking up Stop Line 3, an indigenous woman-led fight you might have heard about happening right now to protect native land and water in Minnesota to stop a pipeline there. They haven't won yet, but they are not giving up. And indigenous groups in general tend to have very limited resources. And so your donations are very much appreciated. Or any kind of participation for that matter. And that's it. Step number 4 is go for it. I'm pretty sure you'll be glad you did. And if you don't like your first choice, try another. There's plenty to do and room for everyone. The most important thing is to start. The rest will take care of itself. And preferably to start now, as soon as possible. There's nothing to wait for. So to leave you with a little inspiration, hopefully, as always, from the young people, here's a couple of youth organizations. This one is called Our Children's Trust. And that's actually James Hansen right there in the corner with his hat on. They are suing at state and national levels to recognize our atmosphere as a public trust to be protected for future generations. Makes a lot of sense to me. Around the world, they've had, this argument has had some success, not too much in the US, but these folks are still trying, and there's amazing youth activists, but a lot of adults supporting this work as well. I mentioned Sunrise. This is a youth movement that is storming the halls of political power around the US in the last few years, is really having a big impact. And here's a smaller group that I'm involved with personally, SustainUS, organizes youth delegations to attend the international COP meetings. And here they are at COP25 in Madrid last year. And I serve on their board. So there's lots of ways to get involved and support. And young people, again, are ready to do this. They feel the urgency. In a lot of ways, they're more mature than many of our so-called leaders. And they have the advantage that they're not held back by the grown-up arguments for why we can't do it, right? They're wise beyond their years, and they deserve our support. And we should follow their leadership, although not leave it all to them, as Greta says. Oh, and this is from the SustainUS webpage. They say, we refuse to allow established leaders to sell us incremental change as the only solution to the global crises. So it may sound cliche, but when your grandchildren or your friends' grandchildren look you in the eye and ask, what did you do? Our answer cannot just be that we did everything we could. It has to be more than that. There's really only one answer. We did everything that was necessary. And this is the end of the book called The Future We Choose by Christiana Figueres and Tom Rivett-Carnick. And so it's not hyperbole to say that we truly are living at a critical time in human history. Let's act like it. Thank you. And thanks for watching. I would love your feedback. So thanks in advance. If you can go to this website and take a short survey or email me. This talk is actually a prelude to a writing project that will be coming out soon, an ebook called Climate Change for Astronomers. And so I'd especially love to hear what you'd like to hear more about, and appreciate your feedback. Thanks again.
Wow, thank you so much, Bernadette. That was really interesting and really inspiring too. I have lots of questions, and I know our audience will as well. For the viewers, if you're watching this video before the Q&A session, you can add your questions to the comment section as well on YouTube. And if you're watching this after the Q&A, there will be a link that you can follow to hear about the discussion. So I very much look forward to that. Thank you, Bernadette, for joining us today.
Thank you, Travis. Take care. Bye-bye.
We hope you've enjoyed today's talk. Each of our talks is followed with a Q&A session that you can learn more about in the video description. If you're interested in Astronomers for Planet Earth, you can learn more at our website, astronomersforplanet.earth, and on social media as well. If you would like to be notified about future talks and events, please follow and join us.